So I am putting this Sustainable Development Report from Jeffrey Sachs and co-authors under new findings in adaptation because I think mitigation and adaptation must always keep an eye on the SDGs and make sure they don't have a negative impact on SDGs, and either they are directly aimed at better implementation of SDGs, or at least the co-benefits are there for SDGs. Mitigation, I always worry, is that two things. One, all the plans of 1.5 degree C, 2 degree C targets and the pathways rely on technological promises of carbon capture, bioenergy, and various transitions, socio-technical transitions, which they are promises. Whether they will be met or not is not entirely clear right now. For example, we don't have a carbon capture method that is easily scalable. There are many being implemented which are really very small scale compared to where we need to be, and the emissions are still going very strong. The curve is not bending. The second one is that the tunnel vision on 1.5 and 2 degree C as the goals doesn't necessarily tell you how the temperature distribution will look and what the impacts will look like, but even if we accomplish these goals. And it's pretty much obvious that 1.5 degrees C is very unlikely to be achieved unless there is some miraculous game changer coming along. Let's hope it does. But in the meantime, what does even a 2 degree C warming mean for the global south, for example? So in that context, sustainable development is a critical part of the adaptation, which is what we are discussing in this series of podcasts. So I thought I will just pick up some points from the implementation of SDG stimulus and looking at some of the SDG indices and dashboards as put together by this team. Obviously, again, I'll be very brief. This report has over 500 pages, including the annexes and country-wise details, which I'm not going to go into. But since I'm sitting in India and I'm the one recording it, I'm going to just briefly mention India's performance on SDGs just as an example. Okay, so the executive summary reads, at the midpoint of the 2030 agenda, all of the SDGs are seriously off track. From 2015 to 2019, the world made some progress on SDGs, although this was already vastly insufficient to achieve the goals. Since the outbreak of the pandemic in 2020 and other simultaneous crises, SDG progress has stalled globally. So the priorities have shifted. COVID came and basically crippled human society, economic activities. The pandemic locked down many industrial activities and economies slowed down, so the economic recovery has become a priority. In the meantime, climate action, SDGs, etc. take a backseat, as you can expect. In most high-income countries, automatic stabilizers, emergency expenditure, and recovery plans mitigated the impacts of these multiple crises on socioeconomic outcomes. Only limited progress is being made on the environmental and biodiversity goals, including SDG 12, responsible consumption and production, SDG 13 on climate action, SDG 14 on life below water, and SDG 15 life on land, even in countries that are largely to blame for climate and biodiversity crises. The disruption caused by these multiple crises has aggravated fiscal space issues in low-income countries and in lower middle-income countries, leading to a reversal in progress on several goals and indicators. Despite this alarming development, the SDGs are still achievable. None of their objectives are beyond our reach. The world is off track, but that's all the more reason to double down on the SDGs. Very good. That's a motivating little executive summary. Let's read a bit more. At their core, the SDGs are an investment agenda. It's critical that UN member states adopt and implement the SDG stimulus and support a comprehensive reform of the global financial architecture. Isn't that a very nice statement? A comprehensive reform of the global financial architecture. Is that really so easy to do? Obviously not, because there are winners and losers with the existing financial architecture, and who controls it and who is willing to give up control and who is willing to change are not at all easy to figure out, or even how to bring them about. To achieve the SDGs, the world must both alter its current investment patterns and increase the overall volume of investments. The stimulus's urgent objective is to address the chronic shortfall of international SDG financing confronting the low income and low middle income countries, and to ramp up financing flows by at least $500 billion by 2025. Good number, but how do we make it happen? This year's report also highlights 6 priorities to reform the complex system of public and private finance that channels the world's savings to its investments, that is known as the global financial architecture. Okay, greatly increase funding to national and subnational governments and private businesses, especially in low income and low middle income countries, to carry out needed SDG investments. Where this money will come from is not entirely clear. Revise the credit rating system and debt sustainability metrics to facilitate long-term sustainable development goals. Revise liquidity structures for LICs and LMICs, especially regarding sovereign debt, to forestall self-fulfilling banking and balance of payment crises. Create ambitious internationally agreed upon criteria for sustainable finance that are mandatory for all public financial institutions. Align private business investment flows with the SDGs through improved national planning, regulation, reporting, and oversight. Align private business investment flows with the SDGs. How are we going to do that? This needs to be done, but how? Reform current institutional frameworks and develop new mechanisms to improve the quality and speed of deployment of international cooperation and monitor progress in an open and timely manner. Okay? Little bit more. All countries, poorer and richer alike, should use the halfway momentum to self-critically review and revise their national SDG strategies and commit to strengthening multilateralism. Okay, so there are some details here which I'll skip because it's something you can read, and these are important statements, but I'm not at all sure what leverages there are to make these things happen. Okay, further investment is needed in statistical capacity and data literacy to support long-term pathways for key SDG transformations. Okay, very good. The SDSN and its global network will double down the Sendai disaster. Let me make sure SDSN, I don't get it wrong. I'm always kind of forgetting the acronyms after I start recording. I read them and I want to remember them and give you immediately what this stands for, but this document is having all sorts of trouble. So let me go up here to the list of acronyms which are here in let's see, LMIC we read. SDSN is Sustainable Development Solutions Network. Sustainable Development Solutions Network. I don't know where I was going with Sendai protocol, Sendai agreement, or whatever it's called now. The Sustainable Development Solutions Network and its global network will double down on efforts to implement the SDGs by 2030 and beyond. Sorry about that. Let's look at some data that the report has got. Lots of figures, lots of indices, metrics, numbers that I'm not going to read. Observed and projected gaps in SDG index score between high income and low income countries in percentage points. We'll also look at the emissions gap in a minute, but the idea is always to set up goals and see where we need to be by 2030 and then keep track of where we are instead of where we should be to be on track to 2030 for achieving SDG goals, and then you call this the gap, right? So here we are looking at the gaps. So projected gap by 2030 is based on extrapolation of annual growth rate on the SDG index over the period of 2019 to 2021. Pre-pandemic projected gap is based on an extrapolation of SDG index annual growth rates over the period of 2015 to 2019 because there was gaps in data and so on. So the gap was here in 2015 with this index in terms of percentage points, and it made some progress and the gap dropped, but projected gap by 2030 with the current trend extrapolated is over 29 percentage points, and projected gap by 2030 with the pre-pandemic trend would have been at 25. So there has been a backstep lack of progress because of the pandemic, so we have increased the gap for projected gap for 2030. Will this pick up and recover? It's not so obvious right now. There is also other perturbations always going on, like the war in Ukraine and its impact on grain exports, fertilizer availability, and of course energy markets and so on, and there is no end to this conflict as of now, so we have no idea what will happen the next few years. Looking at the emissions gap out to 2030 in terms of where we need to be to achieve the 1.5 degree C or 2 degree C pathways. I've already talked about this in various other podcast series, so I won't go into the details, but you know that the 2010 policy scenario is going to take us very high into the gigaton CO2 equivalent emissions by 2030, which is not good news. Of course, gigaton CO2 equivalent is where you are converting non-CO2 greenhouse gases into CO2 equivalent by using their global warming potential, which we have discussed elsewhere. The various other pathways here, current policy scenario will bring us to 2.8 degrees C with a 60% chance by 2050, and unconditional NDC scenarios will bring us down to 2.6. Unconditional NDC scenario is where countries like China and India and others will implement their NDCs even without any help from outside the other countries, whereas conditional NDCs will add some more NDC actions to bring the, this will require help from other countries to implement NDCs, and that will bring us down to 2.4 degrees C by 2050 with 66% chance. And you can look at the emissions gaps. I won't read the numbers, but you can see that they are not insignificant compared to where we would be with unconditional NDCs compared to where we need to be for 1.5 degrees C pathway by 2050. Remember, 1.5 C and 2.2 degrees C are by 2100 with the 66% probability. So we have to be able to achieve those goals by 2100. We need to be on a pathway by 2050, and the emissions have to correspond to that pathway, and these are the gaps to accomplish those. Okay, so this is the gap for conditional NDCs, so to go from 2.4 degrees C to 1.5 degrees C, and you can of course do the similar thing for 2 degrees C pathway with conditional and unconditional net zero targets. Okay, so NDCs with net zero targets. Okay, so all these, as I said, are relying on pathways that rely heavily on technological promises of carbon capture and various other accomplishments in terms of transitions in people's behavior, electrification, renewable deployments, electric vehicles, and so on and so forth. Development practitioners have identified 8 major kinds of capital assets that are needed to stay on track for SDGs by 2030. Human capital, infrastructure, natural capital, and innovation capital. So in the infrastructure, there is energy production and distribution, land and sea transport, telecommunications, digital information services, public buildings like schools and hospitals, and safe water and sanitation. We have talked about these in terms of helping firms and people adapt to climate change, where we were talking about protecting public assets, infrastructure, and public services, critical public services, and so on. So that's the overlap with the need for staying on track for SDGs as well. And all of these map onto adaptation as well, even though now we are looking at them in the context of SDGs. Additional capitals: business capital, social capital, urban capital, and cultural capital. Social capital is social trust and pro-social values, good governance and justice, freedom of speech and the press, trusted scientific capabilities, and international cooperation. Urban capital: spatial human settlements, notably in urban areas, that drive and support productive and creative interactions across the other 7 capital assets. Urban centers are considered separately, even in adaptation with urban resilience and so on, and in climate change in terms of their contribution, and here in terms of urban capital. Cultural capital: appreciation of the diversity of cultures, value systems, languages, the traditional knowledge systems of indigenous peoples, and artistic expressions. So let me leave this podcast here, and we'll come back and continue on more things like the SDG dashboard at the midpoint of the 2030 agenda, and maybe we'll conclude in the next podcast with some numbers on India's performance on progress towards SDGs as well. Okay?